Hi, Flo. What are we talking about today? Back to another pod.
Absolutely. It's always fun, isn't it?
It is.
Well, we've had this really, I guess a bit of a light bulb moment. Ha ha.
We've been doing a lot of professional development recently.
That's a great way to think about it.
And yes, absolutely. We have been inspired, but we've learned so much as well. And on things where I didn't necessarily understand the depth of, I guess, art and science that necessarily went into, the element that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah. And so what is that?
Well, we're going to talk about garden lighting. And I know that we've done an episode before, which is worth looking at because it's a broader, I guess, discussion that we had on gardens at night, really, and planting as well as lighting and all sorts of. Can you remember what else was in it?
Well, we're using things like how the effect of lighter materials at night time. We're using things like reflection.
And variegated plants.
Yeah. So there's all these aspects of what how to make your garden more, I guess, inviting at nighttime. But today's podcast is specifically about using lighting.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And I think we need to be really clear. We are not experts on this. What we are doing is trying to pass on some of the nuggets of gold that we were given by experts just recently.
Yeah, that's so true. I am guilty for thinking I knew more about lighting until I really listened to the experts. A couple of key presentations recently, and then a very special tour that we'll talk about in a bit more detail.
Well, maybe we should dive into actually where we got our information from.
Okay, great.
So how about you introduce the first one, because you saw it live, where I just watched the recording.
Sure. Well, at the Australian Landscape Conference 2025, so held in Melbourne in Australia, a terrific meeting of professionals, international speakers, top of their field and really sort of cutting edge. One of the presenters is a fellow from Tasmania called Landon Bannister, and he represents Dark Sky International. And he gave a presentation on light pollution and how damaging it is. And probably what was really key there is he gave us some really good nuggets on what we can do about it.
Absolutely. So really how we wanted to talk, and sorry, I should say the next thing that we are then going to draw on is we were treated to a fabulous behind the scenes kind of tour at the Melbourne International Flower and Garden Show by a company, Gardens at Night, and also a Canberra-based company, Luxogen, who took us on a tour and actually talked us through how they had lit the gardens for the Melbourne show, and it was just eye-opening. It was, I wanted to say something clever about bright and eye-opening, but it didn't come at the right time. That's able to say with eye-opening and illuminating. That's the one I wanted.
That's it. Well done. Boom, boom. Love it. So true. And, it was really interesting seeing how the same team had worked with each different designer to provide lighting that really complemented the design. And that's what was so interesting. And when we get into examples, talk about, where some gardens had lighting on the water and some didn't, and it had the different effects, what the designer wanted to achieve. The lighting specialists were able to really amplify that. So the collaboration between these two professionals really stood out.
Absolutely.
I'm Fleur, and I'm joined by my co-host and longtime friend, Sachi. We're second career landscape designers and bring our life experience and a fresh perspective to designing gardens.
And I'm Sachi, and you're listening to the On Garden Design podcast, where we chat about what makes a garden great, and we try to inspire and make designing accessible to anyone interested in gardens.
So how about we start, because we were going to have a bit of a conversation about lighting and why is it important generally, and how it can be used well and badly.
Yeah.
So how about you kick off with what you're thinking on sort of, what's the issue here that we're trying to...
So why is it a problem?
Yeah. Well, it can be a problem. It's not always a problem.
Yeah. Well, I think what came out really well in Landon's presentation is he gave these examples about how people are lighting the wrong things. And so there's this sort of over-lighting of your garden or over-lighting in the landscape in general, and it's actually lessening the contrast. So you don't actually get much pleasure. There's no ambience. It's just like this floodlight effect. And that's contributing to the big problem of light pollution in general. But it's also detracting from what you're trying to achieve. It's not picking up on contrasts of textures and movement and I suppose, sort of really focusing on what you're trying to achieve. You're
Highlighting key elements,
You're just seeing this big kind of bright light, and most people seem to do it, but it's not effective at all.
That's right. And in fact, it probably works against what you're trying to achieve. When you're trying to achieve a garden that is a welcoming, interesting place to be in, a lot of the lighting that you might see doesn't necessarily do that. And unfortunately, a lot of people see that their garden is lit and then they think they need more light to achieve a better outcome, when often it's the opposite. They need less. I'm going to add to what you just said, which is something that Landon spoke about in his presentation and really hit home to me, is that particularly in Australia, we have in many places, we are so lucky we can still see the Milky Way and the stars. But in many parts of the world, and in fact in our capital cities as well, we're losing stars at a massive rate because of light pollution. And I wrote down the stat for the EU. So in Europe, they are losing stars at the rate of 9.6% per year. And that's really significant. And the other really nice bit that Landon talked about is this is not a problem like climate change, which is going to take us years to reverse. We can change this super quickly. Yeah, we just need to turn off lights.
Yes,
I really like that. So there's an immediate solution to our growing problem.
Yeah, and so many of the issues that we as designers deal with sustainability and environmental conscience and sort of the morality behind the industry, this one's actually easy fix.
It is.
It's really easy. And as a designer or as a garden owner, you can take control of it and actually make a difference. That was pretty exciting.
It is pretty exciting. And if we all do it, then we'll have a really big impact. But even more exciting.
There's something that I must admit, I just had a thought bubble while I was listening to Landon, and you mentioned it there about losing stars. And I was sort of thinking, and I thought some of our listeners might think that the stars aren't going away. It's just that we can't see them. Mm. So when he says losing stars, and he said like 80% of the world's population can't see the stars in the night sky, it's not that the stars aren't there. It's just that we can't see them because the light pollution is stopping us from seeing them.
That's right. So effectively, we're losing stars as the effect, yes. Although we're not in reality technically.
Yeah. So while we're talking about the problems, and it's sort of bigger than garden lighting, but it's probably worth mentioning some of the amazing things that really struck me when he's talking about what it means to lose stars. And one of the ones he noticed, he really highlighted was that there's a whole, like it's being coined as cultural genocide, is Indigenous groups like the Australian Aboriginals. They are, traditionally mapped and told storytelling from the stars. And now this disconnection from that cultural ability to read the stars and to keep that culture alive is actually a form of, I suppose, disassociation with their culture.
That's right. And it's broader than just storytelling. So they navigated by the stars. They mapped, where they, like their different areas that they, because they were nomadic, travelled to. And they also used the stars to predict weather even. So it has a really big cultural impact, and that's being lost because we're losing stars.
Yeah, that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
And that's just one Indigenous group. I'm sure there's many in the world that are having similar problems.
The bit that struck me a lot was just the health impacts, because we are a species that is, and I'm sure we're not the only, but like all the species are very much based on our circadian system and the rhythm that we get from light and dark, which is obviously through the stars and night and day. And if we don't have a really clear distinction, it can have really big health impacts. And Landon went into some of those as well, which was quite significant and really interesting to think about how we are not helping ourselves as a human species by changing, I guess, our environment in that way.
Daylight saving changes.
I know, hard enough with just an hour change, isn't it?
That's right. It throws everyone in confusion. But yeah, that was a really important point. And of course, the impacts on wildlife.
Yeah.
Really these physiological responses he talked about, like delayed breeding, and also that some of the animals that do navigate by light, like they're assuming it's a moonlight, they're drawn to street lights in lieu and getting caught up in urban areas and, being killed by cars on streets and all sorts of navigational disorientation.
And a really, relevant example for us in Australia is all our turtle species are endangered, and turtle hatchlings navigate using light. And so, unfortunately, if you've got a car park which is brightly lit right next to your beach, it can cause absolute havoc with those little hatchlings that emerge from the sand, going in the completely wrong direction and getting squashed.
And then, of course, there's just the big waste of energy.
Oh, totally.
Energy resources are, it's just a top conversation. We just need to do what we can to try and reduce our consumption.
And it's also impacting, obviously, that has a knock-on impact to climate change and all sorts of other environmental problems if we're not using energy wisely. So there are just so many reasons to actually deal with this in a sensible way. Yeah. So where are we going to go now for?
We've phrased the problem, and so I think it was worth framing the problem because we were quite struck by it.
We were.
And when it gets put out there like that, you think, oh my gosh, there is that tendency to overlight. I mean, people overlight their houses, and that idea of we have to light our gardens for safety and security. But if you don't light them properly, it's not achieving any sort of safety and security at all.
That's right. And in fact, Landon had a really good example of people that put those really super bright spotlights out in their backyards facing away from the house. Thieves quite like them because no one can see into the spotlight. So once they make their way to the house and get beyond the spotlight, a neighbour's not going to be able to see what's going on because the spotlight is in their eyes. So you want to be thinking about that. Not everything that you think is security or safety.
Yeah, for sure. So how do we do it better?
Oh, I know. Good question. The first thing actually I think before we sort of go into the more technical, where do you place your lights and that kind of thing, is the colour of light that you might want to use in your garden. And everyone will know that there's a really different, like if you go into a hospital, you get a lot of the cool white light, where it's that really
shows up all the wrinkles.
It does. It dimples. Shows up all the things you don't want it to show. And it's blinding. It's the blue light element that you're not meant to have in your eyes when you're trying to go to sleep and all of that kind of stuff. So it's the cool light that you want to avoid. And in fact, I was really struck by the fact that they were talking about going into a lot more of the amber light ranges in garden lighting rather than even just the warm white, which is sort of the standard alternative to the cool whites. And I'm not going to get into what sort of spectrums they are because I cannot remember.
We had a great conversation with James from Luxygen, and he was talking all about, actually Blair, I think it was, from Gardens at Night, talking all about the specifications of the lumens and the particular range of lighting. And so it just made us realise there is a whole science behind it.
Absolutely.
And so it really is worth consulting a specialist. There's a whole lot more to it than what we realised, and gave us a bit of an aha moment.
Well, and in fact, the aha moment for me was also that there are whole degrees in this stuff. And people have, studied lighting and illumination as a science.
Yes.
And those people are the ones that often are the ones that are giving you some advice when you're going to experts in the garden field.
It just made me think of a quote out of a book I've just been reading by George Clason. It's called The Richest Man in Babylon. And there is a relevance here, don't worry. And one of the lessons in this is invest thy treasures with the advice of men skilled in the ways of gold. So the point here being is, why wouldn't you consult an expert in their particular field?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Why would you go somewhere where people don't know? Or try and do it yourself if there are people around who do know? Of course, there is the money factor.
Yeah, there certainly is that. Well, you get what you pay for, don't you?
That's right. And it's also something that, if you don't know a lot, do some research. Yeah. Because there are resources around about how to do this in a better way than perhaps you would if you were just guessing on your own.
Okay, so how do we do this better in a context of landscape design?
That is a good question.
Yeah. Let's start. This is what Landon proposed to us, is start on the premise of natural darkness is best.
Yes.
So if you start with natural darkness and then you look at what is it that we actually need to light.
So where would you start in a garden, Flip?
Yeah, so I'd probably start with safety insofar as path. The path from, to the front door might have steps. And that's usually the part where you actually want, if you're approaching the house at night time, you want to have a safe access to the front door. So to me, that's the priority, is just sort of safety. Then the second part is ambience.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I'd almost turn that as your first thing is sort of your safety and security. So it might be, do you need a guide up the driveway, for instance, if you've got a really, wonky driveway, like I've got one that's really hard to see at night. Again, your front path, or is there another path that you use, say, from your kitchen to your compost bin that you want to just have some wayfinding so that you will know where you're going at night? Because that seems to be the time that I always empty my compost bin, from the kitchen into the main bin. So yeah, absolutely, the wayfinding and safety and security.
Yeah.
First place to start. And so let's just talk about that quickly before we dive into the ambience, because the ambience is probably it's the big part of what you talk about.
Yeah.
So what are the things that you learned that you might want to be thinking about wayfinding and that safety element?
I really, and seeing some of the examples, I feel that wayfinding is often done really well with down-pointing bollard, like path lighting. That's a little bollard, and that the light projects down and across the path.
That's right. And it lights up an area rather than, because often you'll see those little spots put into, say, their upward lighting. And one of the things that we did learn about sort of light pollution is why you're lighting the sky.
Yeah.
So you don't actually want to light the sky. You want to light things. And you want to light things in different ways. So this is a classic case of that sort of bollard or little mushroom type lights facing down, spilling light over the path that you want to go on, rather than a little spotlight that's facing up, that's in your face, in your eyes, and is quite a narrow point source. Doesn't actually light an area that you might want to need lighted.
It's so true. And I have, we built our deck 15 years ago or so. No, not quite, 10 years ago. And the builder at the time put in these little deck lights, and they do just point straight up. And I tell you that they're only nice from afar. You look and you can sort of see them sort of reflecting up the columns, but otherwise they're completely impractical.
Now, I'm going to tell you what I did for my deck when we put it in, and we actually put a strip of LED lighting that faces down, but around the edge of the deck. So it almost, you can see the edge of the deck. It spills just a bit of a light because there's a step, and it just gives you a sense that the deck is floating.
Yeah.
So a really different way of doing that, and you don't have it in your face. It gives you some ambient. So really thinking about what you might want around your different areas, particularly with the wayfinding.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's good there where you've got a step down. So it gives you a sense that it immediately says there's a step.
That's right. And so rather than having a strip shining up at you where the step edge is, you might want to put it underneath. So it's shining down and it shows you where the step edge is, but also reflects a bit of light around it.
Yeah. And now I'm in my plans. I've really learned these tricks by working with an architect, actually. And so more and more of the plans now, we recess into like the bottom of a rock, or we recess into the have it into the specifications when the plans are presented, so that there's recessed points where you hide that LED strip up into.
Which was actually a point that was also really, I guess, came home to me when we were talking with the lighting designers. If you can get the lighting designers in up front into the design planning, it means that if you do have any bespoke things being built, you're thinking about, well, how does the lighting integrate into this, rather than whacking it on as an afterthought and it not quite being as seamless or as effective as it could be. So getting that thinking right up front in the design process is really helpful.
Yeah, for sure. Were there any other ones when it comes to safety aspects?
No, I don't think so. I think I guess the other thing is, about how much light you want, because people often go to a bright spotlight as I'm just going to flood this area with light, and that's going to make it secure and safe. Actually, it doesn't, because you create a very bright area which has dark all around it. So it means that when you leave that area, you've got nothing, and your eyes can't adjust fast enough to move from the really light into the dark. So if you lower the level of lighting you have in spaces, it can actually be much safer, because your eyes are not having to make an adjustment from the immediate place where the light falls to the place that is super dark because it's so contrasty. So really thinking about the level of contrast and the brightness of your lighting can be important in the safety side as well.
Yeah, that's so true. So we can do that with obviously in reducing the intensity of the light.
Yeah.
We can also do things like adding in sensors and time limit switches.
Yeah.
So that lights are up.
Or you could do both.
On. What's that?
You can do both at the same time.
Yeah, sensor and time.
Yeah, that's right. And the lower light, and so that you don't have that spotlight that comes on all of a sudden and blinds everything around it.
Yeah. And actually, I find, you go along someone's driveway, like you're driving into a driveway and a spotlight comes on and it actually blinds you.
That's right. So you do want to be thinking about the lighting level, even with a spotlight. Do you really need a blindingly white light where you are going to create potentially a safety issue, and you're going to create all of that really strong contrast with the dark areas around?
Very irritating for your neighbours.
Oh,
terrible. It shines over right into something that you don't want it to be.
That's right. We have one that shines right into a window, and we have to leave that blind down at night. We can't open it because our neighbour has a very bright spotlight right on the edge of their deck.
Well, they need to listen to this podcast.
They do. Might have to send a note just in the mail. Well, let's talk about ambience now, because that's the fun stuff.
It is the fun stuff.
So where would you start?
Well, when I think of ambience in night lighting, I think about you picking a couple of things in a garden that you want to really it just sort of gives you that whole feeling of like the garden's soft and gentle and inviting. And I think of things like water features. I think of a couple of feature trees, and then just
maybe a statue.
Yeah.
If someone's got something that they want to highlight in that way as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's something that's a feature. It's a feature. That's something that's, and the feeling you get from seeing that feature at nighttime can be quite different to the feeling in daytime. So the gentleness of that light just creates a very attractive contrast to the different light of the daytime.
Absolutely. And the thing that really struck me here was really thinking about what it is that you want to highlight about that feature, whatever it might be.
Yes.
Do you want to bring out the details and the texture? Do you want to have a swathe of light that kind of gives you a sense, like in a big water feature, of what it is? Do you actually want the water feature to be lit, but not directly?
Yeah. Is it actually about shadows?
That's right.
Because sometimes you've got these beautiful, like laser cut screens or some kind of feature. I think we saw one out of Africa Garden at the garden show, where the patterning in the steel was such that the shadowing was really the feature.
That's right. And it might even be foliage that gives you that amazing shadowing as well. Yeah. So really thinking about what it is that you want to light it for.
Yeah. And then I guess when we talk about trees, and we saw a lot of examples of this at the garden show, where I said this to Blair, I said, so is there a rule where you put, how far out do you put the spotlights from the trunk of the tree you're trying to highlight? And he said, well, it all depends. This is where the art came into it. And he said, well, if your tree is one that has a canopy and you're actually trying to uplight the canopy, then that positions at a certain point. But if it's actually the trunk and the bark that you want to highlight, or the branch structure, that's a different arrangement. So you've got to actually look at what is it that you're trying to highlight. And if there is no canopy, then don't point the things up.
No, because you're just, again, wasting highlights. Yeah, exactly. And I guess there's a whole element here of, if you're talking to a professional, they'll be able to tell you what strength light, how big your, little spotlight point should be if you're using a spotlight, or what type of light you might want to use to do these things best, which we're not even going to cover because we don't know that level of detail. But there is a lot in it.
But we're aware now.
That's right. And I guess one of the concepts that really came across to me is really thinking about using light to graze a surface rather than hit it straight on. Because if you graze a surface, you'll get that texture, you'll get the light playing on the surface. You won't get it sort of just bouncing back and reflecting. And I think it's a really important concept to be thinking about. So even if you are lighting a deck, do you want it to graze across the surface of the deck rather than hitting it straight on and just being like a spotlight on it? Or if you're highlighting a beautiful rock feature around a water area, do you want to just graze the surface of the rock so you see all the textures along the rock?
That's another word, graze. I think because visualize what you're talking about there, that projection of a light. That's the only time I've heard of graze in a positive way. Oh, actually, no, as in graze food.
Well, I'm big on grazing with food, definitely.
I was thinking of graze knees. I was thinking of my kids.
Oh, right. I was thinking about, animals grazing in your vegetable patch that you might not want so much.
There you go. Any grazing light. I like that.
Yeah, they are right. Grazing light. Yeah. So the other thing I just would also that I picked up was really thinking about like the density of the plant that you're lighting. It can have a really big impact on how you light it. So if you have a mop top, what are they called again? I can't remember the name of the tree. Anyway, those grafted, massive, really dense.
It's like robinias.
Robinias, that's it. That's what I was after. You're going to light something like that is really dense and quite fine, very differently to, say, a eucalypt, which has very loose and lots of branches, and you can see the structure. So thinking about how your structure is going to, I guess, dictate how you might want to light that plant as well, because you don't need a really strong light on a small eucalypt because there's not a lot that it's going to pick up on.
Yeah.
Whereas for a robinia, you might think very differently about how you light that.
Yeah.
That was an extreme example, obviously, with the robinia.
And most of the tree lighting that you saw was really effective. We're talking about those adjustable spikes. So the little sort of spots that you adjust and they spike into the ground and they're adjustable. So that's sort of what we're talking about there. You know, when we talk about path lighting, often it's like a little bollard light or a little mushroom light or a little eyelid light. Yeah. Step lighting, often the little eyelid light. That's right. It's about picking the right configuration of light or the right sort of fitting for the right place.
And the thing on fittings that you do want to be thinking about is whether they do have some kind of a little hood. So it's not just dispersing the light and it goes up as well as out, because that starts to really direct the light and it stops it from being very bright in your face if it happens to be in a position where it might actually reflect into your eyes too. So hoods are very important in lighting.
Well, one thing that really struck me when we were rummaging through these beautiful show gardens at the garden show in Melbourne was a comment that Blair said, which was about you want to hide the source of the light. And there were times I was down on my hands and knees trying to find where's that light coming from? And there was this beautiful glow, but the light itself, the fitting itself is hidden. And that's often the point people miss. They stick these lights out in the middle of places and make the light themselves almost a feature. But really, it's the effect of the light. It's what you try to light that's the feature, not the light itself.
That's right. But that obviously, you just need to use your judgment, because if you've got pendant lighting, that is your lighting feature. So again, it depends. And you might have some beautiful pendants that you have over an outdoor table, for instance, that gives you some nice soft glow. But obviously, if you've got path lighting, you don't necessarily want something that's going to be, say, look at me, rather than providing that safety lighting along the path. Absolutely agree.
So how does festoon lighting fit into this?
It's a good question.
Yeah, because it's popular in a back garden. It creates a beautiful ambience. But it does create a beautiful ambience. What's that?
It can create a beautiful ambience.
It can. Yeah. And I guess it's about also making sure you get the globes that are that warmer amber light as opposed to the white light. But it sort of maybe goes against some of the principles that we've been highlighting as good choices for lighting.
Not necessarily. I mean, if you had like a pergola and you did want to sit out at your pergola, festoon lighting, a soft festoon lighting, not really bright LED in, very high density, might be really nice way of lighting up that area without having some spotlights, or because it's quite hard to light a pergola without either a strip of lighting or some particular points. So festoon lighting could give you quite a nice glow around the edges, for instance, and that might be enough if you're entertaining people, for instance.
Something about festoon lighting that's quite joyful.
That's right. I think it depends on
festive, isn't it?
Yeah, but it depends on your festoon lighting, because I'm also thinking of those horrible Christmas lights, the little LEDs, which can be really dense and, changing colour every 5 seconds. That might be someone's, thing, but perhaps only at Christmas. Maybe it's not a year-round thing. And do you want, very white, because often LEDs are quite cool light too, whether that's the right thing for you year-round. Particularly in cold winter, you might not want really cold light.
Yeah, that's true.
It's true. But look, courses for courses, some people might really like that look. you've got to talk to your designer about what you're after.
That's right.
So what else? I'm conscious that, we've been talking a lot about lighting and how we might use it. Is there anything else that really stood out for you?
I think one thing I just wanted to mention was the effect of, or the conversation about to light a pond or not to light a pond.
Oh, yes. Yeah, absolutely.
And I wanted to draw on two examples we saw. One was a garden called Ode.
Beautiful garden.
Yeah, all these gardens were stunning.
They were.
And this one in particular has this big circular reflection pond, quite central, so quite a strong axis, and this was in the centre of the axis. Now, the pond was deliberately not lit, but what was lit were the trees that were around the pond. And so as you looked into the reflection pond, you got this beautiful reflection of the lighting of the trees. So the trees were kind of reflecting in the pond, and I thought, that's clever. Because the tendency is to light the pond.
That's right. And when you just think about the types of lighting that ponds have, it's those lights that just shine up out of the pond. And you really do wonder what the point of those are. But I thought it was really clever. They made such a deliberate decision not to light the pond and to rather capture that reflective element of what that pond was intended to be in that garden.
And then a great contrast. So here's the same team, the Gardens at Night, who are doing all the lighting for these different gardens. So they clearly listened to the designs and worked with the intent of each designer. So then you look at the other garden I wanted to mention, which was Ben Hutchinson's Between Moments garden. And he's got this sort of naturalistic pond in the garden, and the pond itself had lighting projecting into the water, and it created, so it was underwater lighting, and it was sort of positioned under the rocks, and it projected through the water. It was raising through the water, and it was all hazy, and it created this really sort of soft and romantic effect. And, when you're sitting in the sauna looking out into that pond.
Oh, I want one of those saunas.
Yeah.
With that pond. Yeah. No, not just the sauna.
And that was a completely different approach. And so the intent there was to really create this sort of romantic, hazy kind of feeling of the water.
Yeah, that's right. And they also used, because Blair was talking to me about how they lit up some of the feature boulders around that beautiful pond as well to bring out the texture in them. And so you're really thinking about the form and the shape of the pond. It wasn't just these lights shining out of it, but it also wasn't a setting where you needed the reflection, because you were actually looking at it from a distinct, building. You needed it to be lit in a particular way to make it work. Absolutely. It was a great distinction between two very different ways of using lighting. And in fact, we should put some photos, if we've got photos of that on for this episode as well.
It's a great idea. Well, I think, and probably the key message there is that just because you've got a feature tree or a pond, you don't necessarily have to light it the same way. There's different ways of doing it. It's about really what's the effect you want to achieve and what's that ambience that you're trying to pull out of it.
That's exactly right. And I think it is all about that. So taking a really good hard look at your space, what do you need to light? And then what do you want to light?
Yeah.
They're probably the two questions you need to ask yourself. Yeah. And then the next question is how?
Yeah. And lighting too much, it loses the effect. And you've got to be very discerning and say, what are just the few things that will make this garden look great if they're just highlighted at night?
That's right. And one last thing that I guess I'd like to add is that if you feel like you've got a space where you have not enough light, I would suggest you take away all your light and start again.
Yeah.
Because often you'll realise it's not about not having enough light. You've got too much light and you need more contrast.
Yeah.
So really thinking about how your light plays into your shadows, which is so important.
That's a really good place to end up on, I think.
I think it might be too.
Yeah.
Hopefully that's been helpful for people because, as I said at the beginning, we are non-experts, but we're trying to just capture some of the gold that was shared with us over the last couple of weeks. And we certainly will be applying what we know in a bit more rigour now to what we do as well. So hopefully that's been helpful.
For sure. I mean, for both Sachi, we just found it really aha moments. And it's an area that we all just sort of assume we can do, but seeing it done well is all the difference.
Makes such a huge difference.
Yeah. Hope it's got you thinking about what you're going to do in your garden this Well, this year.
That's right.
Project list.
Especially given that you've got your winter recess now before spring comes in, if you're in Australia in one of the colder climes. Anyway, it's been lovely talking again, and we will be coming back with perhaps a couple more episodes in the next while. So watch this space and look forward to talking again soon. Bye.
Bye.